Hi there, and welcome to the Explaining History podcast. Apologies, I didn't get to record last week, extenuating circumstances. But anyway, here we are back again, and I'm going to try to get a couple of recordings this week. We've got the monthly book review, actually last month's monthly book review, on the way. But today I'm going to be talking about the acquisition of atomic secrets and the development of the atomic bomb by the Soviet Union between 1945 and 1949, when the first Soviet bomb was tested. One of the reasons why I want to talk about this is because it helps us to explore an interesting facet of the culture of totalitarianism. Lavrenti Beria was Stalin's head of the NKVD, mass murderer, prolific rapist, and all-round monster in waiting, was put into the unusual position when he was working on the bomb project of having to give the scientists absolute creative leeway. It was in many ways it was his idea that he understood very little about science and the processes of developing an atomic weapon, and he understood as well that if he allowed the scientists the kind of creative freedoms that they've been allowed in the West, that it was likely that there would be a similar outcome. And this is antithetical, really, to Soviet communism at this stage. The idea that specialists are left alone to get along with things without state oversight and without ideological oversight must not have been a simple thing for someone like Beria to digest. The top scientist on the Soviet team was Igor Kochetkov, who was called in front of Stalin to be told that this was task number one, and that whatever the Soviet atom scientists wanted, they should just ask for, and it would be granted. Stalin later said to Beria, treat them well, because in joking, really not joking, he said, we can shoot them later if we need to, but treat them well now. And because this was viewed as task number one, because it was going to give the Soviet Union the kind of power and prestige that Stalin hoped for, and it was going to cancel out the American bomb, Stalin in 1946, when the country is utterly devastated still, and the majority of the population are living, if not in actual starvation, then in hunger and hardship, was able to grant to several thousand engineers, scientists and technicians a standard of living beyond their wildest dreams. Beria is made deputy premier with general responsibility for state security, or the atomic bomb minister, if you will, commissar, if you will. He loses his NKVD portfolio. How he felt about that is unclear. And his sole responsibility is to build the bomb. He was, among his many failings and monstrousnesses, Beria was, for Stalin's purposes, a skilled organizer. Beria's organization of the Soviet camps, the Gulag system, to build it into a kind of a mass construction project, a means of exploiting labour on a mass scale, was something that Stalin greatly admired. Beria had also been chiefly involved in the espionage operation to steal atomic secrets from the Manhattan Project. So he was no newcomer to the development of an atomic weapon. But it was Stalin, perhaps, that was more educated on the subject. The conclusion put forward often by Trotsky that Stalin was, an unimaginative dullard couldn't have been further from the truth. He was an exceptionally intelligent and sharp individual, and he understood from the late 1930s onwards the possibilities that nuclear fission could have, and had educated himself on the writings of Einstein and other people on this very topic. Initially, during the war, the early years of the war after June 1941 and Barbarossa, Stalin was unconcerned with it. He was aware that the British and the Americans were ploughing ahead with research, and at a certain stage, the publications on atomic science coming out of Britain and America during the war and news reports on it go deathly silent, which Soviet intelligence correctly took as an indication that the British and the Americans had really had significant successes in their research, and defence notices and all that kind of official secrets sort of stuff had silenced it. Stalin was initially unconcerned about the atomic bomb. He was perhaps slightly more interested in whether the Germans were able to develop it, and as the Red Army in 1945 marched into the Reich and into Berlin, one of their key targets was the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, because that was where things such as atomic science and rocketry and all the stuff of modern warfare, where the German research could be found. He was, as I said, initially not that interested in the implications of the atomic bomb until he sees it tested. He was aware that there was this what was referred to as an experimental super bomb on the horizon, but he was convinced in 1945, when the bomb was dropped, that it was really a message for the Soviet Union, and subsequently historians have supported this view that Truman was sending, as a new anti-Soviet American president, was sending out a message loud and clear about where America's red lines lay and what might happen if the Soviets crossed them. Initially, during the war, Stalin had believed that the progress of the Manhattan Project would be so slow that the war would be over, for better or worse, by the time that it could be deployed. There were weeks in 1942 and 43, particularly 42, where Stalin wondered whether the war would be over for him pretty soon. And there were moments where the entire regime wondered whether they would be able to hang on for much longer. So a timescale of 3 to 5 years for the completion of an atomic weapon, an Allied atomic weapon, meant very little to Stalin. However, by the time that the first American bomb was tested and then dropped in August 1945, a new world had emerged, and a new superpower status for the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was a military superpower in terms of manpower and military productive capacity, the ability to build tanks and howitzers and all the rest. But technologically, it's certainly not, and Stalin was right to assume that it would be technology that would decide the outcome of the Cold War. Therefore, for Stalin, the bomb was a Cold War issue. It was something that was unlikely to have featured during the Second World War, but it became a part of the new landscape of the Cold War, and therefore its acquisition is absolutely essential. It's the contention of Anthony Beevor, for example, that the existence of an American bomb was the thing that stopped the Soviet Union from, as Stalin had toyed with the idea, sweeping across Western Europe. Stalin was well aware that there were plans, fairly ludicrous plans it must be said, but plans put forward by Churchill to try to drag America in 1945 into a further war against the Soviet Union by invading Poland and trying to force the Soviets back off Polish territory. And Stalin would have heard all about this through his various agents in British intelligence that was so successfully penetrated at the time. And so his natural inclination towards paranoia and paranoid suspicions of the West would have been aided by these kind of bizarre outpourings by Churchill. And therefore the bomb once again becomes the solution to Stalin to redress this imbalance in Cold War power. On the third day of the Potsdam Conference, I've definitely mentioned this one before, it was among one of my favourite Potsdam anecdotes, Truman came to Stalin and said, well, we have tested a bomb of unusual destructive force, to which Stalin said nonchalantly, I'm glad to hear it, and I hope you will make good use of it against the Japanese. He was obviously the Soviet infiltration of the Manhattan Project, where many of the atomic secrets had been procured from, which gave the Soviet scientists something like about 18 months to 2 years head start on the project. It was this espionage that had told Stalin everything he needed to know. The way that Stalin dealt with this information from Truman was to call together his team, particularly Vyacheslav Molotov, and say, right, we're going to make our project go faster. We are going to speed up what our scientists are doing. And this is a typical sort of thinking from the devisers of the 5-year plans. In Sheila Fitzpatrick's Everyday Stalinism, she writes about the local party bosses who, without an enormous amount of skill or know-how or managerial experience or any of that, simply looked at the projects that they had to complete, be it railways or hydroelectric dams or what have you, and through sheer kind of belligerence and berating and anger and aggression, flung human beings, skilled and unskilled, at the problem, working around the clock until it was done. A brutal way of getting things done, but these were the kind of party apparatchiks who were really emulating what was being said and done on high. All we'll do is we'll speed things up, we'll work harder, or we'll, work people to the bone, and when they drop, replace them with others, and we'll get the job done. And this was the secret, really, behind many of the advances of the Soviet era, of the Stalinist era. Don't worry too much about the human cost. Stalin correctly guessed that the British and Americans knew that they were in a race against time. The British and Americans knew that at some point the Soviets would acquire the ability to create a bomb, but the Americans assumed it wouldn't happen for at least a decade. And when the Soviets detonate their first bomb, and the Americans detect it on Labor Day 1949, obviously very quickly they smell a rat and assume it's down to espionage, which for a large part it was. Stalin looked at the bomb and thought the British and the Americans, or principally the Americans, as the British received their bomb slightly later, they are going to use this leverage to try to shape the Cold War in their own interests as quickly as possible. To which Stalin thought, well, no, I will not permit that. And so the sense of urgency in acquiring a Soviet bomb was immense. Stalin believed that even with an atomic bomb, and he had a good understanding of how many the Americans had developed, he thought that by 1949 that the Americans still didn't have a sufficient and overwhelming number of nuclear weapons to be able to completely overwhelm the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union attempted to fight a conventional war. So he wasn't utterly intimidated to start with, but obviously he didn't want to be in a situation where he was threatened with a nuclear weapon because there might be every chance that he would be forced to back down. So one of the difficulties in the Soviet bomb project was the degree of paranoia that both Stalin and Beria had. It was assumed by Beria that his spy rings must have been uncovered and were being allowed to continue in order to feed disinformation to the Soviet Union. Beria essentially told his agents that he would have them recalled and shot if they passed disinformation along, which probably didn't aid the intelligence gathering process. Similarly, what Beria needed, and eventually what he gets, is a scientist who is able to understand the intelligence material that's being passed to him, and this was Kochetkov, the most successful Soviet atom spy, Klaus Fuchs, who was a German communist who had wound up in the employ of British intelligence and who had passed on the most detailed intelligence. Eventually, Fuchs and Kochetkov, it's doubtful that they ever met, through correspondence, secret correspondence, managed to become a very powerful team in developing the bomb. Now, it would be wrong to assume that the Soviet scientists were simply reliant on espionage. Espionage just speeded the process up. The Soviet atom scientists had roughly the same basis of understanding and skill as their Western counterparts. One of them was the later dissident Andrei Zakharov. And if there was anything that was making to make it less likely that Soviet scientists were able to have the same successes as their Western counterparts, it was the Soviet system itself, which Beria sensibly removed as a burden from most of the scientists and technicians' shoulders, and allowed them simply to work unfettered by Soviet bureaucracy. One of the main challenges was finding sufficient amounts of uranium. The Germans had been very lucky in their invasion of Belgium. In 1940, the Belgians had mined Congo, which they had occupied as colonizers since the 19th century, for its huge quantities of uranium, and there were warehouses full of the stuff. The Soviets eventually found uranium in Kazakhstan. They managed to take some of the uranium that was in Germany in 1945, but a lot of it fell into American hands, along with rocket scientists such as Wernher von Braun. So the scrabble for enough uranium for a bomb, was a really significant part of the difficulties that the atom scientists overcame. The impact on Cold War politics of the detonation of the first Soviet bomb in 1949 is instantaneous and significant. The developing anti-communist hysteria in America takes a huge leap forward. The Soviets now have nuclear weapons, and the fear of internal subversion in America is added to with a belief that now nuclear warheads are targeted, or nuclear bombs at least, are targeted at mainland America. And whilst this was entirely unlikely to have been the case, the security that the bomb temporarily brought America is replaced with a sense of anxiety and doubt. And it's rather unfortunate that the first Soviet bomb is detonated in the same year that China falls to communism, thus throwing the cloud of suspicion over the State Department, and the question as to how communism has had all these successes is answered eventually by people like McCarthy, who say, well, it is spies and traitors in our midst. And indeed there were spies, not that McCarthy would have known who they were or have any indication as to how many there were. He was utterly ignorant on the subject. But the Venona Decrypt, which was the intelligence that was gathered through cracking Soviet codes using essentially the ultra code that the British had pioneered during the war. The Venona Decrypt showed that there was all sorts of contact with Soviet embassies from agents within the State Department, and it also exposed the Los Alamos atom spies and led to the arrest and later execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, and the arrest of Klaus Fuchs, and of a range of other British and American Soviet agents. One standard justification amongst many of them, there was an agent based in Britain, going back a couple of decades now, Melita Norwood, who was exposed in Christopher Andrew and Vasily Mitrokhin's book, The Mitrokhin Archive, in the early 1990s as a Soviet agent, and she was being quite an elderly lady at that time, and said, yes, of course I did all these things and I don't care. It was my view that the USA having one atomic bomb and nobody else having one made the world dangerously unstable and more likely to have a nuclear war, and it was only just and right that the Soviets have the same technology. And she's obviously a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, but it's possible, it's just possible, that the ability of more than one power to wield that kind of destructive force actually made nuclear war less likely, not more so, but it's perhaps a debate for another time. Anyway, thanks for listening, and just a few quick announcements. We're going to be transitioning over to a new podcast hoster soon. We'll be able to do all sorts of kind of cool and fancy stuff, but there is going to be some advertising. We're going to try not to kind of let it strangle the podcast, but that is on the way. It means that we'll be able to monetize what we do. No more begging letters, no more begging bowls, and it means also that I can get unlimited content on here, so we can maybe even get this podcast going a couple of times a week. If you're studying and heading for exams, check out the Explaining History YouTube channel. It's got a ton of handy stuff and advice for students that you don't get on the podcast. So get yourself over there now onto YouTube, like it, subscribe, and away you go. Anyway, I'll catch you sometime later this week, and thanks for listening to the Explaining History podcast. Bye-bye.